A native woman shut her eyes expecting death, yet woke in a cowboy's bed instead. Before the tale begins, remember to like the video and share in the comments where you're watching from. The northern hills and town carried a sharper cold, the kind that made teeth ache and breath sting as it entered. Sheriff Luke Carver leaned low in the saddle, gloved hands tight on the reins, his horse's hooves crunching over the frozen snow crust. Rides this far out were thankless, but he made them still. He told himself it was duty, watching for wanderers, outlaws, or hunters trying to sneak past without paying town tax. But truly, it was silence he longed for. Silence meant no questions. He could not answer. Silence meant no faces waiting for him to speak when he had nothing worth saying. Luke was only 32, still young by many standards, yet his body bore the years of uniform life before the badge. The war left scars unseen. He came west, hoping the land might bring peace. Instead, it gave him a badge in a town too small to matter, except to those living there. Still, he wore it, bearing it like a weight. By day, he kept order. By night he returned to his cabin, ate alone, slept alone, woke alone. He told himself it was fine. 2 hours from town, his horse damp with sweat, he noticed her. At first it looked like a bundle tossed near the trees, dark against pale snow. Motionless, he slowed, scanning the woods for ambush. Last fall's raids had been real, and settlers quick to strike back without care for who they harmed. His hand touched the pistol grip by habit, then he dismounted, boots crunching toward the shape. It was a woman, curled by a fallen pine. Stiff from cold, her face slack in faintness. Her skin was bronze, lips blue, hair black and frozen where it spread on the snow. The deerskin dress she wore was torn. A strap broken, fabric ripped along ribs and hip. Bare flesh showed in gaps, bruised in some places, raw in others. Luke's stomach twisted. It wasn't just cold that brought her here. Someone had used her, maybe worse, then left her. He crouched, pressed his hand to her neck. A faint pulse beat under chilled skin, so faint he nearly missed it. He pulled back, ears sharp. No voices, no fresh tracks but his own. Whoever was here had gone. The question left was if he dared take her in. He hesitated. She was native. Her looks, her clothes, the beadwork still clinging to a strap showed. Bringing her to town was danger. Cold Ridge had men who'd rather see her dead than sheltered, and women who would spit at her feet. But he couldn't leave her. Whatever. The crime or claim, abandoning her meant death, and he couldn't ride past with that guilt. His father had taught him better. Luke slid his arms under her, lifting her off the snow. She was lighter than she should be, body tight with chill, breath shallow on his chest. She stirred once, eyes half open, whispering something unclear. Maybe a name, maybe nothing, then she sagged limp again. The ride back was slow, her weight dragging his horse, sky darkening fast. He wrapped his coat around her, pressing her close, trying not to notice how fragile each breath sounded when the horse stumbled. Fear cut him sharper than wind. Fear she'd slip away before they reached shelter. Fear the lawman in him carried not a survivor, but a body to bury. At last the cabin came into sight, smoke faint from his last fire. His arms numb from holding her steady, he kicked the door open, carried her inside, and laid her on his bed, the only bed, narrow and neatly kept until now. He set her on the quilts, pulled the lamp close, and looked long. Bruises marked her ribs and thigh, her shoulder bore a scar he didn't know. Burned, not cut, and old, enough to scar, but still red at the edges. Whoever had done this hadn't. Just left her. They had broken her first. Luke lit the stove until it glowed, filled the kettle and set broth to warm. His hands shook slightly as he moved. He was not a man who showed feelings, never had been, but the sight of her stirred. Emotions he didn't want to name. Pity, maybe anger, surely, and also a steady, deep resolve. When he touched a damp cloth to her lips, her eyes opened again. dark eyes, sharp even through haze, fixed on his face for a moment. She didn't speak, but the fear was clear. Not fear of dying. She had already accepted that, but fear of what he might take before the end. Luke leaned back, holding her gaze calm and steady. "You're safe here," he said softly, though he wasn't sure she understood. "Not going to hurt you." Her eyelids closed again, but her breathing grew steadier. Luke sat in the chair, by the bed, waiting as the broth cooled, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't know why she had been abandoned, or what danger she might bring when word spread. All he knew was that he couldn't ride past. Not her, not this time. And that single choice on a frozen night near the timberline would change everything. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Luke let his eyes close, though he never truly slept. He slumped in the chair beside the bed, one hand close to his Colt on the table, the other stiff from carrying her through snow. Every sound, the pop of sap in the stove, the hiss of wind through shutter cracks, kept him half awake. Each time she stirred beneath the quilt, his head rose fast. The soldier in him refused rest. By dawn, his eyes burned from the long watch. When the first light pushed through the window slits, he leaned forward to check her breathing. She was warmer now, still weak, but her face had lost its blue shade, and her chest rose more evenly. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt a weight heavier than his badge. He had brought her here, and what came next rested on him. Pulling on his boots, he fed the stove, then went outside for water. The world was white and brittle with frost, snow piled high along the cabin wall. He paused at the door, scanning the trees. No tracks but his own, no smoke beyond. Whoever left her to die had done so far from here. Still, he knew men in town would want answers. Some would want blood. When he stepped back inside, cabin air already warmer, he saw her eyes open with awareness for the first time. She lay still, hair tangled across the pillow, body pulled tight under the quilt. Her gaze fixed on him the moment. The door shut, sharp, guarded, fear flickering along her jaw. He set the bucket down slow, keeping movements calm. "You're awake," he said. His voice sounded rough in the small room, and he realized he hadn't spoken more than a few words in nearly a week. "Name's Luke Carver, Sheriff." She studied him silently. He could see her measuring him, weighing if he was just another danger. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. After a long pause, she pushed herself up on one elbow and took it with trembling hands. She drank in small sips, eyes never leaving his, her lips parted finally, voice hoarse. "Nieli." Just one word, but enough to make her more than the body he had carried from snow. Luke nodded. "Nieli," he repeated, the name strange yet steady on his tongue. He set bread and beans on the table, warmed them in the pan, and brought her a plate. She ate carefully, like someone who had not known steady meals in a long time, and in the lamplight he saw the bruises more clearly. Marks on her ribs, welts on her thighs, an older burn scar on her shoulder. He looked away before she caught him staring, not wanting her to mistake concern for something else. Still, questions pressed heavy on his chest. Who had done this? Why? Leave her to freeze? And why so close to the timberline he always rode? She gave no answers, and he did not ask. He knew trust needed time. Survival first. He stood, took his coat, and moved to the door. "I need to ride into town, check the post," he said, hand on the latch. "You'll be safe here. Wood stacked, stove will hold." He held her eyes until he was sure she believed. She gave a small nod, but her fingers clutched the quilt tighter. Luke stepped into the cold, sharp against skin after the cabin's warmth. He mounted his horse and turned down the trail, but his thoughts stayed behind. He replayed the image of her lying in his bed, eyes sharp despite weakness, body marked by violence and frost. He thought of the town, how they would look at her, What they would say if they knew she was under his roof. For 3 years, he had kept law here, never once inviting anyone past his threshold. He had lived careful, distant. Now, one frozen choice had broken that distance, and he couldn't regret it. When he returned later with salt, flour, and coffee from the store, she sat upright by the stove, wrapped in his quilt, mending the torn strap of her dress with careful hands. A crooked thread from his sewing tin tugged rough through the cloth. The fabric still gaped open, showing more of her body than she likely wished, yet she worked on with focus. When he entered, her eyes lifted. For the first time, they carried no fear. Instead, they held something harder to name: tired recognition. Maybe even the smallest spark of trust. Luke set the supplies down, jaw tight beneath the weight of it. Whatever story she carried, it wasn't finished, and whether he wanted or not, he was inside it now. The day stretched in the cabin with quiet. Not empty quiet, but one filled with little sounds: the stove settling, water bubbling, the scrape of a needle biting cloth. Luke had come back from town with goods and set them neatly on shelves, all the while sensing Nayeli's gaze from her place near the fire. Wrapped still in his quilt, torn dress beneath, she stitched slowly, fingers awkward with stiff thread but unwilling to quit. He realized then he had never asked if she even knew how to sew or if she wished to. The thought struck sharp. He knew nothing of her, not where she had come from, not how long she had been running, not if family lived for dress patched enough to hold. The bruises across her shoulder had deepened, and in the glow, the burn scar marked into her skin stood plain. It wasn't chance, too precise, too intentional. He wanted to ask, but kept silent. She wasn't ready to speak, and he wasn't ready to hear what kind of men left such marks. Instead, he asked something easier. "You got family anywhere?" Her eyes shifted. She stared into the lamp's glow as if weighing her answer. "Not anymore." That was all she gave, and it was enough to end it. Luke nodded once, slow, not pressing further. He knew the weight of losing people. He had buried too many of his own during the war. Then he turned back to his work, the revolver's steady click filling the room while she returned to sewing. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but a bridge neither dared to cross. Later, when the fire burned low and the cabin cooled, Luke dragged his chair closer to the stove to doze as he always did. But when his eyes drifted to the bed, Nayeli had shifted to the far side, leaving space beside her. Her eyes were half shut, but still watching him steady. He paused, chest tight, the choice sharp in his mind. If he lay there, things would change. If he stayed in the chair, the distance would remain. He didn't move, not yet. Instead, he pulled the quilt closer around her shoulders, settled back in the chair, and let sleep take him light. Her breathing steadied, and in that rhythm, he found a peace he hadn't known for years. What he missed, as the fire crackled low, was her hand sliding into the space where he might have been, testing the ground between them, waiting to see if it held. The storm struck sudden, fierce, without warning. By late afternoon, the sky turned to lead, trees bowing under winds that roared through the ridge like a freight train. Luke had seen enough winters to know the signs. He checked shutters twice, stacked more wood by the stove, and tested the latch on the door. By nightfall, snow slammed against the cabin walls, wind drowning all other sounds. Inside, the fire glowed, but cold pressed through anyway, the kind that crept into bones and held fast. Nayeli sat on the bed, wrapped in his quilt, watching him with tired eyes. She had eaten earlier, beans and bread, all she could manage. Though some color had returned to her face, her body still showed sharp lines of hunger. Her patched dress clung uneven, collarbone stark, legs tucked under blanket for warmth. Luke saw her shiver even across the room. He poured hot water into a tin mug and set it beside her. "Drink. Helps keep cold out." She took it, hands trembling on the metal, drinking slow. Her gaze shifted to the window where snow slashed the cracks. "This storm," she murmured, voice tight. "It won't stop soon." Luke shook his head. "Could last all night, maybe longer." She lowered her eyes, pulling the quilt tighter, silent. Luke kept busy with small tasks, oiling the rifle, checking the kettle. But his eyes returned to her often. He saw how she fought to hide weakness, jaw clenched though her body shook. He understood. Pride was all a person had when everything else was gone. But cold like this wasn't about pride. It could kill as quick as lead when the shivering deepened. He made his choice. Setting the rifle aside, he crossed to the bed. She stiffened when he sat on the edge, eyes fixed on him, searching his intent. He kept his tone calm. "You won't make it through the night like this. Fire isn't enough. Body heat's the only way." Her lips pressed thin, breathing sharp. For a moment he thought she'd refuse, and he braced to pull back, let her decide. But then she gave a single nod, hands clutching the quilt as if it were her last guard. Luke pulled off his boots and eased onto the bed, careful not to crowd her. The quilt shifted as he lay beside her, the heat of his body drifting across the narrow space. At first she stayed stiff, her back half turned, but the cold pressed harder, and at last she leaned in, her forehead brushing his shoulder, her hand resting lightly against his chest. He felt her pulse in her fingers, quick and uneven, yet alive. He did not move to hold her, did not let his hands wander. He stayed still, his breath calm, his warmth offered without demand. Slowly, her trembling faded in the hush that followed. Questions rose, the ones he had left unspoken since the night he found her. He wondered if her own people had cast her out, or if settlers had sold her. Wondered what cruelty had left the bruises. Wondered how long she had been running. He also wondered what it meant that she lay in his bed, not as a woman he had taken, but as a life he had saved. Neely's breath steadied against him, and at last her voice broke through, quiet and unsure. "I thought I would die out there. I closed my eyes and waited, but I woke here." Luke turned his head, catching her gaze in the lamplight. There was no thanks in her eyes, not yet. But there was a raw truth he had not seen before. "Not on my watch," he said, his tone rough but steady. She studied him, then pressed her forehead fully to his chest. Sleep found her soon after, her hand still against him. Luke stayed awake longer, the storm outside beating against the cabin, thinking of what it meant to share his bed for the first time in years. It wasn't closeness, not yet. It was survival. But it had shifted something between them. And he knew when the storm passed, nothing would be the same again. The storm cleared by dawn, leaving the land buried in drifts rising halfway up the fence rails. The cabin still stood strong, smoke curling from its chimney, but the silence outside was heavy, almost crushing, as though the snow itself smothered sound. Inside, Luke moved slow from stove to table, pouring hot coffee in a tin cup while watching Nieli stir beneath the quilt. She shifted sluggish, her face softer with rest. But when her eyes opened, the weariness came back sharp. She had survived the night. That much was clear. Her skin carried warmth now, her breathing stronger, her shoulders no longer trembling beyond control. Yet Luke knew survival wasn't all that mattered. If she stayed under his roof, questions would rise. The town wasn't blind, and in cold. "Ridge," no secret lasted long. He set the cup near her. "You'll need strength. We're going to town." Her eyes sharpened quick, her fingers clutching the quilt. "Town!" Her voice edged with fear. Luke nodded. "Supplies are low. Flour, medicine, a few things I can't go without. If I ride alone, folks will wonder where I've been, why I need twice the food. Won't take long before they come asking. Better they see you with me under my watch." She searched his face as though trying to read if he spoke the full truth. In her silence, Luke felt the weight of what she had suffered. Settlers who saw her as less than human, men who treated her as trade. He kept his tone steady. "I won't let anyone touch you. Not in town, not anywhere." By mid-morning, the sky cleared enough for travel. Luke saddled his horse, tying a rough second seat from rope and blanket. When she stepped outside, wrapped in his spare coat that dragged heavy on her shoulders, her eyes darted over the endless white as if danger hid in every drift. She climbed onto the horse behind him, her hands light on his waist. Not for closeness, but for balance. The ride was long and heavy, the snow deep, but the nearer they rode to town, the more tightness built in Luke's chest. He knew Coldridge, knew every pair of eyes that would turn on them. He had always kept his distance, respected for the badge, but never close enough for talk. Bringing her here would break that distance forever. As soon as they reached the main street, heads turned sharp. A rancher stopped mid-step outside the livery. Two women with baskets paused, whispering behind their shawls. At the saloon, a pair of men leaned out, grins sharp and mean. Luke kept, his face hard, his hand near his belt, daring anyone to step close. He stopped before the general store and helped Nieli down. She kept her chin lowered, dark hair falling to hide her face, but he saw her shoulders square, her back straight. Pride even while afraid. Inside, the store owner, Ezra Maddox, froze when he saw her. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed thin. "Sheriff," he said slowly, eyes moving between Luke and Neely. "Didn't know you'd taken to keeping company." Luke stacked flour and coffee on the counter, his voice low but firm. "I'll pay in full." Ezra's gaze lingered on Nieli, disapproval plain. "You sure that's wise?" Luke silenced him with a look that ended the talk. "Put it on the scale." The weight of that moment carried through town. By the time Luke led Neely back to the horse, whispers had grown, but no one dared step forward. His steady, armed presence was enough to keep distance. Still, he knew this was only the start. Back at the cabin, Neely set aside the coat and sat by the fire, clutching the quilt tight. "They hate me," she whispered, no surprise in her tone, only fact. Luke hung his hat, placed the supplies down, and turned to her. "They don't know you, only what they've been told. But they'll think twice before crossing me." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and if they do, he held her gaze steady, "then they'll answer to me." For the first time, she breathed out something close to relief. Not full trust yet, but the start of something she hadn't known in years, protection without a price. And as the firelight flickered across them, Luke knew his path had narrowed. Whatever his life had been before, it was now bound to hers. No turning back. Days after their first trip into town settled into a rhythm unlike any Luke had lived. The cabin, once silent save the crackle of the stove or scrape of a chair, now carried the sound of two lives moving within. At first, the change jarred him. He had lived years in routines where no one asked where he went or noticed when he returned. Across from her, eating slowly, aware of her eyes on him. "You always live alone?" she asked at last, her tone cautious. Luke nodded. "Always." He didn't add more. That even with soldiers, townsfolk, and men who called him sheriff, he had never let anyone close enough to change that truth. Nellie lowered her gaze, pushing beans around her plate. "Alone is easier. No one can wound you when there is no one left to lose." He recognized the truth in her words, but he also heard the ache. For the first time, he wanted to ask about her past, the scar on her shoulder, who had abandoned her in the snow. But he held back. The time would come when she chose to tell it. And when it did, it had to be her choice. Instead, he reached for the pot and filled her plate again. "You won't go hungry here," he said simply. That night, the stove burned low and they sat in dim light. Neely braided her hair with slow, practiced hands, head bent, while Luke sharpened his knife at the table. The firelight shaped her, her face, her features no longer hollow, her eyes alert, alive. She lifted her head once, catching him watching. For a moment, neither looked away. Then she let the braid fall over her shoulder and returned to her work, but her expression carried a faint softness. When Luke finally lay down, he expected her to keep her distance. Instead, as cold pressed through the shutters, she moved closer, her hand brushing his arm, hesitant but sure. His breath caught, not in shock, but at the weight of what it meant. He didn't pull away. Slowly, she left her hand resting, her body curling toward him for warmth, not from storm now, but from choice. Luke lay awake longer, staring at ceiling beams, realizing their silence had changed. It was no longer only survival, it was trust beginning to take root. Fragile but real. And he knew if the town or the past tried to take it, he would not stand aside. He would fight, no matter the cost. The thaw crept in by mid-March. Snow softening underfoot, water streaming from the hills into thin lines of mud. The peaks still shone white, but winter's hold was breaking. With it, the days in Luke's cabin shifted into something calmer, steadier. Routine became second. Nature, Luke chopping wood and riding his patrols, Neely tending the fire, sewing, cooking meals. What had begun as survival now looked like a life shared. And though neither spoke it, both knew. The townsfolk had not let the matter rest. Luke heard it each time he passed through Cold Ridge. The muttered words near the livery, the sharp stares from men who spat in the dirt as he walked by. The barkeep at the saloon made a joke too loud one night. Though Luke said nothing, he stored the sound of laughter away, as if writing down a name on a wanted sheet. Still, no one dared face him. His badge and reputation kept them at bay, but he knew it wouldn't hold forever. Whispers had a way of growing sharp at the cabin. Neely had changed as well. She no longer jumped at sudden sounds, no longer clutched the quilt like armor at all times. She wore the patched dress she had mended and sometimes stepped outside beneath open skies, breathing crisp air as if relearning what it felt like to exist past fear. Luke noticed the strength in her frame now. Her shoulders held steady, her steps firmer on the thawing ground. The bruises had faded, but the scar on her shoulder remained, and though she never spoke of it, he noticed her hand brush it unconsciously, as though reminding herself it no longer ruled her. One evening after supper, Luke sat cleaning his rifle. At the table, while Neely brushed her hair by the fire, the lamplight caught her face, her hair falling loose along her back, and Luke found himself watching longer than he meant. She looked up, caught his gaze, and instead of looking away, held it. "You don't ask me questions," she said at last, her tone steady but low. Luke set the rifle aside. "Not my place to force answers. You'll tell me what you choose when you choose." Her eyes softened, though her lips pressed thin. "I was taken before the snow," she said, almost to the fire rather than to him. "Traitors, they sold me like meat. I escaped when they turned on each other. I ran until my legs gave out. I thought freezing in the snow was better than going back." Luke's chest tightened, anger flashing hot, but he kept it steady. "You're not going back," he said, his voice like iron. Silence stretched between them, heavy yet not uneasy. Then she rose, stepping across the room to where he sat. She stood close, firelight warming her skin, her eyes searching his face as if testing if he meant the words. Her hand lifted, brushing his cheek with hesitation, then rested there. Luke stayed still, breath caught, thoughts sharp. He had held back for weeks, afraid of what it would mean to cross from protector into something more. But when she leaned, her lips touched his, the wall broke. The kiss was slow, unsure at first, then deeper, carrying the weight of everything they had left unsaid. When they parted, her forehead pressed against his, her breath quick. "You treat me as if I'm not broken," she whispered. Luke's hand rose steady on her back. "Because you're not," he said. The fire burned low as they stayed close, neither pulling away. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying the sound of a world that would never understand. What had been built in silence between a lawman and the woman he saved. But inside, the line they had guarded was gone, replaced by something fragile, human, and true. Luke knew the town would demand answers soon, maybe worse, but he knew one thing clear. He would not face it alone. Not now, the days after their first. Kiss carried a quiet charge. Something new in the cabin air, both of them felt, though neither named. Luke went about his work as always, splitting wood, riding for supplies, checking ranches. But now, when he returned, his eyes searched for her first. Each time he saw her by the fire or bent to her sewing, his chest tightened. Neely moved different too, no longer clinging to the quilt, no longer shrinking when he looked her way. She carried herself with a mix of caution and growing trust, testing each step forward in the bond between them. The town stayed restless. Whispers grew sharper, though still behind Luke's back. He heard them when he passed through. The claim that he had taken her as a prize, the sneer that a sheriff had no right to live with an Apache woman. He didn't answer, but it burned, and more than once his hand lingered on the grip of his Colt. Each ride home, he feared town's ugliness might follow. But each time he opened the door and saw Neely alive, warm, that fear dulled into resolve. One evening the wind rose hard, rattling shutters though no storm came. The stove glowed steady, the room filled with the smell of beans simmering low. Luke sat at the table, boots unlaced, body aching from the ride. Neely placed bowls down and sat across from him. They ate in silence until she set her spoon aside and studied him. "You hear what they say about me," she said evenly. Luke met her eyes. "I hear, doesn't matter." Her brow furrowed. "It matters to them. They think I am shame, a burden, maybe worse." He leaned forward, voice flat. "Let them think it. They don't decide what you are. They don't decide what I choose." Her eyes searched his, and after a moment she nodded. Something in her posture shifted, not lighter, but stronger, like she believed him. She rose, cleared the bowls, then crossed to where he sat. Without words, she placed her hand on his shoulder. Luke froze, breath catching, then let himself lean into her touch. The fire dimmed lower. As the hours passed, when Luke rose to add wood, Neely moved with him, her hand brushing his arm on purpose. He turned, and before thought, she stepped closer, her lips meeting his again, this time no hesitation. The kiss deepened, her hands clutching his shirt, his arms closing around her waist, pulling her near. Months of silence, restraint, and distance broke in that instant, replaced by heat and certainty. He lifted her easily, laying her gently on the bed. The quilt slipped, her patched dress falling loose at the seams. She did not cover herself, not this time. Instead, she met his gaze with steady resolve. Luke cupped her face, his voice rough, almost broken. "Only if you want this." "I want," she whispered, her hand pressing firm against his chest. The night stretched long, filled with closeness neither had allowed before. It was not rushed or wild, but slow and certain, each touch careful, each kiss deepened by trust built through long frozen weeks. For Neely, it was proof she was more than what had been done to her. For Luke, it was proof he was not meant to live and die alone. Morning came, pale light spilling through the shutter cracks. Neely curled against his chest, her breathing calm, her hand resting steady on his skin. Luke stayed still, staring at the beams above, his thoughts sharp and fixed. The world outside would not accept this, but the cabin was no longer only his. It was theirs, and no law, no whisper, no man could take it without a fight. The thaw came, stronger as April drew near, the creek behind the cabin rushing with meltwater, the ground soft under the horses' hooves. Luke woke earlier than usual, sun not yet over the ridge, and for the first time in years, he didn't rise to silence. Neely lay against him, hair loose across the quilt, her breath steady, her hand still resting where it had fallen in the night. He stayed longer than he should, watching the way light touched her face, the quiet strength she carried even in sleep. For a man who had lived years with only his badge and empty routine, it was a sight he had never dreamed to know. When she stirred, her eyes opened slow, sharp as ever. For a moment she looked at him as if testing if what had happened was real. Luke spoke first, his voice low. "You belong here. If you—" Others, weighing his words, but one hard look from Luke ended it. Ezra rang up the supplies without a word. By the time Luke and Nieli walked back into sunlight, whispers filled the street, but no one stepped near. The sheriff had spoken. Back at the cabin, Nieli stood on the porch while Luke unloaded the goods. She was quiet a long while, then said, "You tied your name to mine. That cannot be undone." Luke straightened, meeting her gaze. "I didn't tie it. I gave it. If you'll take it." Her hand gripped the railing, her voice unsteady but firm. "I will." The weeks that followed brought harder work. Fencing, planting, long days with the cabin filled by earth and wood smoke, but the air between them no longer held doubt. At night they lay close without hesitation, her hand finding his arm, steady around her. The scar on her shoulder no longer looked like a mark of pain, but a mark of survival, and Luke traced it not with pity, but respect. By late spring, he built a cradle from pine, plain boards smoothed by hand, not because a child was expected, but because Nieli once spoke of her mother making them, and he had listened. When he carried it inside, she stood quiet for a long while before resting her hand on it. "You remembered," she said softly. "I remember everything," Luke answered. The cabin that had been only his now held two lives bound together. The town would never fully approve, but it no longer mattered. Sheriff Luke Carver, who had spent years returning to nothing but smoke and silence, now had someone waiting by the fire, someone who had come to his bed to die but stayed to live. Nieli, who had fled violence and closed her eyes to snow, now opened them each morning in a place that was hers by choice, not force. Their story did not end in distance or doubt. It ended here, in a cabin at the timberline, with the sound of thawing earth outside and belonging within. The man who had belonged to no one, and the woman who had been claimed by no one, now belonged only to each other.